Okay. In the last section, we ended up talking about the man the hunter paradigm, which was dominant in anthropology up until about the 1960s and 70s, and the fact that it was not a not a particularly accurate way of describing the ethnographic record, the world that people were actually living in. And now we're going to talk about some social change that happened after World War II in the Western world. There was a massive social shift, and World War II was instrumental in that. As I said, Margaret Mead was also a major figure in that. So women who were alive in after World War II and adults after World War II pretty much all knew who Margaret Mead was. But everybody did. She was very well known at the time. In any case, she was around from 1901 to 1978. She's known for her studies in Samoa and working with the concept of gender plasticity. And this is the idea that gender not only can change within cultures, but also is different across cultures. So it's a basic idea that challenged the biological determinism within anthropology at the time when she started studying it. She was saying, no, it's not. Sure, it's tied to biology, but it's not determined by biology. People can construct gender roles in many different ways, even though they are tied to biology. So it wasn't an outright denial of biology by Margaret Mead, but there was the introduction of the idea that it was plastic. It could change across cultures and within cultures. And much of her work was in Samoa. A famous book, Coming of Age in Samoa, is probably it's one of the classics that people should read if they're interested in that sort of thing. It has been challenged. This guy Derek Friedman, who made it basically his life's career to challenge everything that she reported back from Samoa. In any case, she did observe gender plasticity there and brought it back to the United States. And as I said, she wrote academic articles on it. She also wrote in popular magazines like Red Book that were directed at housewives, basically. And her ideas on gender plasticity became somewhat mainstream. Now, she found an audience for this because of World War II. If she tried to do this in the 1940s, probably nobody would have paid attention to her. But World War II, everything changed. All the men pretty much had gone off to war. Not every single one, but a large chunk of the men in their primes anyway were sent off to World War II, to the Pacific theater, to the European theater, and so they had to leave their jobs. They couldn't run the factories, they couldn't run anything else they were doing. And remember, this is at a time when mostly men are doing work outside the home. Women are more likely to be doing work inside the home, and so that was a major dent in the economy. Still, things need to be done. It was even more urgent that things be done during the wartime because we had to produce for the army, right? We weren't going to win a war if we didn't have good economic production at home. So what happened was there was a government call for women to go out and fill the jobs of the men that went off to fight the war. And if we look to the right here, we got a picture of Coming Age in Samoa. That's the front of that front cover of that book, one version of it, and that's Margaret Mead in the middle there, in case you're curious. Down below that, we've got Rosie the Riveter, who's this icon, and it's taken on a bunch of different meanings over the years. A lot of people have lost track of the fact that that was a government program. Right? That was a government advertising program to convince women that they could go out and do their husband's jobs. Right? And it was called Rosie the Riveter. I don't know if that was the official name or that was just a name that got thrust upon it. But it was initially a government program, and it was to deal with the stresses of wartime. They had to get the stuff done, and ultimately they were able to do it. Right? So women came out, they did those jobs, jobs they had been told for a long period of time that they shouldn't do or absolutely couldn't do. Right? So now they had mass evidence to the contrary. And men went off to war, and many of them got killed and horribly injured and came back, and they figured they were going to resume their old lives. Turned out that wasn't the case necessarily. Some of the women who had gone out and worked in those situations wanted to continue to do that. And so there was a national discussion that ensued. And that's just when Margaret Mead was publishing on this very topic. She was publishing on it based on her observations in Samoa. She was also presenting a very different world in which there was apparently more gender plasticity than in our own culture. So she was unhinging it from the biology to a large extent, unhinging gender from the biology. And that's been spun out to its logical conclusion, I suppose, at this point. But we'll leave that for now. Okay, so that was the big shift that happened in World War II. So there was a major restructuring of Western society after that, and particularly at the universities. Where anthropology is concerned, that's going to be important because that's where a lot of the anthropology happens. There is anthropology that happens outside of universities, but there's not very much of it. It's called applied anthropology, and that's when you try to use anthropology to solve real world problems. And there are anthropologists who are employed in that kind of work, but they're few and far between. So most of this is going on in universities. And one major change in the universities in the 1970s was women entered into the universities in general much more than they did before. And they stayed there too. Right? Even if women went to college before that, they were less likely to become faculty. That completely shifted in the 1970s to the point that, well, anthropology has been dominated by women pretty much since the late 70s or 80s. And I can tell you stories about that I've heard from the women in anthropology, because most anthropologists are women. Yeah, even in terms of the internal politics of the AAA, that was an issue that they had to account for. They had massive gender imbalances, and there was also some animosity going on within the field, not just within the field, within the universities. Okay, so the whole question shifted at that point, right? There were still men around, still doing what they were doing, certainly in the 1970s and 80s. But women came in and started asking different questions. Right? And as I said, they moved out into the field and they were able to get different answers because they had different access to information that men just didn't have access to at the time before that. So that shifted a lot of things in the West and shifted our interpretation of what was going on out in the ethnographic record in the rest of the world. Right. Here I want to bring us back to the sexual division of labor, which took center stage in terms of what people were interested in anthropology regarding sex and gender. That was they were interested first in sexual division of labor, why there is such a thing, and what's the nature of it, and later that morphed into an interest in patriarchy, why patriarchy exists, and we'll talk about that. And I think at this point, it's moved into identity politics, full-on deconstruction of both patriarchy and masculinity, and that's taken a whole different direction. But we'll back up to the 1960s and 70s. People were interested in the sexual division of labor. Women coming into the field were trying to sort this out. Why is there the sexual division of labor? This is more or less what it is. This is information taken from the HRAF, which you may recall from our methods lecture early on in the course, was the Human Relations Area File. And that's a database so anthropologists can feed their information, their numerical information. Remember, their quantitative data, the things that they could count and assign a number to, and was suitable for submission to a database. They contributed that to the databases of the HRAF, or multiple databases they maintain. And so if you had a question that could be answered by descriptive statistics, you could subscribe to the HRF, get access to, at the time that this chart was made, it was 185 societies. So 185 different cultures. It's probably more now. So somebody did ask the database what the breakdown of male to female activities was. And they got this kind of a list. They made it into categories: generally male activities, generally female activities, and swing activities that could be done by males or females across those 185 different cultures. They had a longer list of things that were generally male activities, and second longest was the swing activities, and the shortest list was generally female activities. And you notice right at the top, you got hunting and you got gathering. Right? That was the basic distinction that we mentioned before. Men do most of the hunting, particularly if it's large animals or dangerous hunting. They do that, and women do most of the gathering of plant materials, whether it's fuel, firewood, or wild vegetable foods. That's a huge thing. As I said, 65 to 85% of the food that people eat in hunting and gathering groups comes from women's gathering activities, not from men's hunting activities. Right? We also mentioned that they were egalitarian in nature. Across those groups, they did have sexual division of labor, but they also had gender egalitarianism. and that is was largely maintained because men contributed in other ways as well. It wasn't just the food they were bringing in, but meat is also a prestige food in most cultures relative to plant food. Right, it's something that people want, they need, and they assign a higher value to it. And so this kind of balanced out in terms of status, right? Even though women were technically contributing more. But again, we had an egalitarian hierarchy. There was no hierarchy. Men and women more or less equal, and that was true across all the groups, pretty much. Right. So if you want to look through these lists, you'll see some of the things on there. You can also make connections back to biology for some of them, right? Some of the hunting things, I'm not going to make those connections right here, but you probably could if you worked at it. Gathering, we have to think also that this is largely taking place in an absence of birth control and formula and other things that have allowed women to separate themselves from the basic biological processes involved in reproduction. Before those things existed, women were going to have children, and they were going to have to take care of those children in ways that they don't now. So, if you think about the general activity of hunting, it's hard to do if you have a child that's breastfeeding. That's just damn near impossible to do in those circumstances. On the other hand, you can gather plant foods very effectively if you have a child that's breastfeeding. Bring the child along with you and put a sling around you and keep the baby and do what you need to do. You don't have to move fast. It's not running away. It's not dangerous necessarily, or no more dangerous than anything else if you live in a jungle or a desert. In any case, this was compatible with dealing with children who are under the age of 4 at the same time. Right. So you have to bear in mind the women were doing everything with those children under the age of 4 and pretty much always had one around. So, and what would happen around age 5 was the children would generally split off. So the boys would start going with the men, and most of the time, unless it was something that was very dangerous or was too far beyond them, but most of the time they'd go with the men, and the girls would stay with the women because they were each learning what they needed to do. They learned all the skills that they needed to know, and the boys needed to know what the men were doing, and the girls needed to know what the women were doing because they had that sexual division of labor. All right. So if you think about some of these in the context of basic reproduction, no birth control, no bottles, no formula, nothing like that. Children are breastfeeding for up to 4 years. I think we mentioned that earlier on. Excuse me. That's something that doesn't happen in the West so much because we went through the modernist period where we thought that for a brief period, we thought that breastfeeding was not a good thing for children. If you go prior to that period, we were just like the rest of the world. But we went through a phase where they phased it out completely. All right, they said you shouldn't breastfeed. We have formula alternatives that are made in factories, and they're far superior nutritionally to breast milk, which is just nature, and that's not very good. So that was the Dr. Spock period. And eventually they realized that, well, no, there are reasons you should breastfeed. And there's a transfer of antibodies from the mother to the child that protects the child for a period of time when they're very young. Several other things, some things they understand, some things they don't. But breastfeeding is generally good for children. And we figured that out and we started reintroducing it. Even so, we didn't reintroduce it for as long as it had been customary before. So I think I mentioned that before. We were talking about hunter-gatherers. We talked about a condition called lactational amenorrhea. In those hunting and gathering groups where you had relatively lower amounts of calories coming in, so they weren't malnourished, but they often were hungry. So they didn't have a huge surplus of calories. There were lean periods. And when a woman's body is not taking in enough to support a pregnancy or a breastfeeding child, a condition called lactational amenorrhea will kick in potentially, and she will not get pregnant, even if there's a possibility of that. So it had the effect in hunting and gathering groups of sort of naturally spacing out the children 3 to 4 years. Right, so you'd have one child breastfeeding at a time. We could expand on that, but we don't necessarily need to at this point. Okay, we do have to bear that in mind in terms of the sexual division of labor, though. All the stuff that you can't do with It's very small children, toddlers, infants, hang around with you at the same time. There are no babysitters. Everybody's well, there are, but they're all doing the same kind of work. Um, so once the boys hit age 5, they can hang in there with a lot of these things. The men will slow down when they need to, and they see it as crucial to the learning of the child. Child has to learn how to fill their role as a man when they grow up. Same with the women, but their activities are lower key because they have younger children. All right, so you're welcome to look at the list and see what you can make of that. See which things seem like they're biological in nature, maybe a biological explanation, and which things are more cultural, social constructs. Moving on. Now, I like to survey the students occasionally, as I said before in the first part of this, and I did that exactly based on this model more than one time. We have data from one or two classes, I think, in the slides that are coming, but basically I did the same thing they did here. I listed a bunch of activities. They weren't trapping and building boats. I just thought of things that we have to do on a day-to-day basis in Western culture. And then deliberately I steered away from different professions and focused more on things that people do just to maintain their lives, right? Not what you do for a living, but what you do to live every day. So I came up with a list of activities, and then I asked the students to put it in these categories: generally male, generally female, or swing activities. Right, and this was long before I did the other one. This is probably like 5 or 6 years ago now. All right, so let's look at the results of that, because you think we went through this massive social change and maybe we eliminated sexual division of labor. Well, when I asked the students, these are the responses that I got. There was a sexual division of labor. They were able to break the things up into mostly male and female and swing activities. And I broke it down by male, female, and unsure. Those are the categories that I used. So we've got a standard bar graph here, and it's got an entry for each one, a bar for each one of these categories: male, female, or unsure. This is the number of students who said one category or the other. Right. So I looked at the data, and then I broke it up into mostly female, mostly male, and swing activities. So cooking dinner fell under mostly female, and we had, I think, 40 people said that's mostly a female activity, and 8 people said it was a male activity, and 27 were unsure. So there's a high degree of uncertainty on that, I would say. Balancing the checkbook. Twice as many said male, but still most people said that was a female activity. Almost an equal number of people were unsure, but the plurality said female. So it made it into this. Grocery shopping. 0 people said out of that group that it was a male activity. All right. It was an equal number of people who said it was a female activity and who were unsure. So nobody said it was specifically male, though. I guess that's interesting. Feeding babies. There were 2 people that said that was specifically a male job. All right. I think they were not necessarily thinking of breastfeeding. There was room for interpretation of these, and that was kind of built in. I was sort of playing around with the language to see how people would interpret it. So anyway, 2 people said, no, that's a male activity. If I had phrased it as breastfeeding, probably there would have been somewhat different responses. Although I do recall from that group, there was one young lady who was absolutely insistent that breastfeeding was a conspiracy used to suppress women. And she said that men were equally capable of producing milk to feed babies, and it was just a means of oppressing women. That they did not. They just refused to do it. Later on, I did check on the biology of that, and that's not really true. I mean, we do have the same plumbing in terms of the primary sexual characteristics. It is possible for men to produce milk, but not nearly in the quantity that you would need to keep a child alive, and wouldn't be a natural thing in the first place. So I'm not sure where she came up with that idea exactly, but she may have accounted for one of those 2. I'm not sure. In any case, the thing was split. You could think of a lot of things. You could think if you thought of breastfeeding, you probably said it was a female activity. If you thought about like doing the airplane thing and feeding the baby, obviously both parents are likely to do that. So a high degree of unsure. The most certain thing was that sewing on buttons, 60 people said was a female activity. Only 7 were unsure, and 0 said it was male. Right. We may come back to these and think about them a little bit more. Move on to the swing activities. Earning money, high degree of uncertainty. Only nine people said it was a primarily male activity. 5 people said it was primarily female activity. Right? 65 people said don't know. Could go either way, which makes sense based on my experience. Men and women are both equally participating in the economy. That seems like it probably would be. That's why I stayed away from occupations. I just mostly focused on categories of things that people need to do in their day-to-day lives. Disciplining children. Whoever's closest, I don't know. 45 people said they were unsure. There was a little bit more of a majority there that said it was a male activity, but still a lot of people said it was female activity. That's pretty uncertain. Washing dishes. It was a very low number of people who said that was a primarily male activity. High degree of uncertainty, and fair number said female. All right, so those are the ones I lumped into the swing category. Mostly male activities. You notice that there's a different pattern in these than there was in the mostly female activities. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's look at the categories. Car repair. 0 people said that car repair was primarily female activity. 67 said male. That was the most certainty I think that we had. Yeah. So 10 were unsure. Maybe. You never know. 64 said fixing sinks was a male activity. 0 said it was primary female, and 12 said unsure. Paying for dinner. Wait a minute. A lot of people, 38 were unsure about that one. Nobody said it was, one person said it was a female's job, and 29 said male. Now that one, I knew that I was tapping into something that was a little bit different. It's not just a matter of, that's not a clear cut question on making money. We had that money question. Everybody was uncertain about it. But paying for dinner, that had something to do with the demographic that was responding. I asked a bunch of college students, a couple of sections of Anthropology 102, and they are young, they're dating, and they're thinking about it in terms of dates. And date protocol doesn't necessarily conform to our ideology. It doesn't necessarily conform to any other expectations that we have. All right? It's not necessarily like the rest of life. We have a ritual that we go through in dating, and part of it is, going out to dinner and paying. So paying for dinner, it depends on how they were interpreting it. If they were thinking of it in a dating context, they're never going to say that it's the female that should pay. Right? It's going to be mostly the male that should pay. If you're thinking about it in a general context, maybe the people that have been in a relationship for a long period of time, or didn't have a relationship and weren't dating, didn't care, or older people. Maybe they've been married for 10 years. Well, yeah, and everything's kind of pulled together anyway, and it's uncertain, to say the least. But still, nobody said it was a female activity primarily. One person. Okay. Mowing lawns. 52 said it was male. And 0 said it was female. 28 unsure. Killing spiders. 34 said it was male and mostly unsure. Whoops. Hit the wrong button there. Mostly unsure. Still made it into the mostly male category because of almost near lack. There's one guy that was certain it was the women's job to kill the spiders. Arachnophobe. Taking out the garbage. Again, you still had kind of a split between the unsure and the male, but the female was really low. So that's the way it broke down. And one of the things I realized eventually, I did this later, and I've always had a majority of female students. As I said, women entered into the universities, and that balance has been continually shifting ever since then. Within anthropology, it's been particularly female heavy, and I usually have about 70 to 80% women in most of my classes. I think, and it's been more and more women as we go along, and that's a little bit ahead of the university curve, which has women at about 62 or 3%, I think it was at Cortland last time I checked. Is over 60% female. So there's a greater and greater proportion of female students at colleges and female faculty as well. Excuse me. So what I realized at one point was we had a class where there was a big imbalance between the male and female students. So we had probably like 85% female in the class in the first place. And it happened to be a day, something was going on. It was just after a holiday or something. And we had no men in the class. Like, none of them showed up. And we did the poll. And it came out very uncertain. Right? I realized that most of the uncertainty that we're seeing in the poll was not coming from the guys. The guys were the ones that were saying, "Oh, I know what everybody's supposed to be doing." And when I had a group of just female students, or maybe one or two guys, there was everything was uncertain. Like, I couldn't have made the same breakdown. Like, it wouldn't have worked out at all. So you can interpret that how you may. I just thought it was interesting information, which I did get from students like yourselves. I just asked the class. Same with that. The other question that I asked in the last section. That was all just students like yourselves responding, telling me what they thought. And I'm always interested in that. Also interested in how it changes over the years. It changes less than you would think. All right. In any case, back to the theory in anthropology. All right. We started off with the man the hunter paradigm. There was this sort of faulty assumption about the nature of sexual division of labor in hunting and gathering groups in the first place. That is, who was producing and how much people were producing, and what the interpretation of that was, the importance of it was. So there were problems with that paradigm. They started realizing that in the 1970s when we went into the field. Eventually, they started looking at it in a little more nuanced way. And this was the next important theoretical approach to dealing with the sexual division of labor in anthropology. It was a shift away from the man-the-hunter paradigm to the public-private dichotomy. And Maria Lapowski was instrumental in producing this concept, and she is one of the people who wrote one of the readings that was assigned for this section. So if you're interested in that is the same person we're talking about. Public-private dichotomy. Now, I need to explain the difference between public and private. It's used differently than it is in normal conversation. In this case, they mean public refers to work that's done outside of the home. And in the public sphere, outside of not just the home, but the family. That's the thing. People think it's just about what you do in the house, like housework. It's not about that. It's about the distinction between family and non-family, right? So the public world is the world outside of your close kinship network. And the private world, in this formulation, is everything inside your kinship network, right? And the idea was that men dominated that public sphere in most anthropological contexts, and women dominated the private sphere, right? Now, this kind of works out because it does shift depending on the structure of your society. All right, if you think about a hunting and gathering group, the private sphere is huge. It's your entire group, right? So women are not going to be disadvantaged in that at all, according to the public-private dichotomy. Women are going to be dominant, in fact, in the social relations in those cases, because within the family, if your entire band, remember, is 50 to 300 people, and they are all related to each other. So your entire band, your entire social world is within your kinship network, and women dominate things inside the kinship network, the private world, then they're not going to be a disadvantage whatsoever. Men will be at a disadvantage. Now, that public world grows as society gets more complex. As we produce surplus, shift from hunting and gathering to pastoralism, we saw a distinct shift to patriarchy as well. Excuse me. That public sphere grew a little bit, but also the nature of production changed in that case. We see horticulture. There's every indication that women should have more power in horticulture, but what happens, and this was explained by the public-private dichotomy, at least how it was explained by the public-private dichotomy, is that as we have more people, that necessitates a more complex social structure, and that public sphere grows. Right? In a hunting and gathering group, it's real small. Everybody's related, but as we get more and more people, fewer and fewer kinship relations are recognized, right? So you can't be related to everybody when you got thousands of people. So when you have even more complex societies like chiefdoms and states, that public sphere just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And so that explained, initially this was explaining the sexual division of labor. By this time it had morphed into explaining patriarchy, right? Patriarchy is a circumstance in which men have more power than women in general. And public-private dichotomy does give an explanation for that. If that's the case, then it makes sense that hunter-gatherers would have had an egalitarian system, sexually egalitarian system, even though they had a sexual division of labor. And even if whether there was sexual division of labor or not, when we had more complex cultures that had a larger public sphere, it made sense that patriarchy would emerge. Right. So this was an explanation that seemed to be credible in the face of evidence, unlike the man the hunter paradigm. Right. So as I said, most of the concern shifted to that patriarchy away from the sexual division of labor. It was accepted that that was pretty much what went on, but it was also recognized that even though there were differences, there was egalitarianism in hunter-gatherer groups, and it was the patriarchy that became the primary concern. And so that's what most anthropologists that were interested in sex and gender, and that became really big in the 1980s. Pretty much everyone was doing something that they had to have some connection to sex and gender, even to get published on anything. It was that's as it was explained to me. It just dominated the field so heavily, and at that time they had made the shift to being concerned about patriarchy. The fact that they looked at the entire ethnographic record and did not find incidents of matriarchy, which would be a circumstance where women have more power than men, was troubling to anthropologists. Right? So they were looking and they were finding egalitarian societies, and there was an argument about whether there were even egalitarian societies. And that's what the two pieces by Lepowski and Goldberg were about. That was from a series called Opposing Viewpoints, where they take two experts in whatever the field is and that have different positions from each other and have them each write their position. So that's what these are taken from, the Opposing Viewpoint series. And Goldberg was I believe he was a sociologist, and he was arguing for the biological determinist point of view, which we mentioned earlier. And Maria Lepowski was arguing not for matriarchy. She was arguing that there are egalitarian systems. Goldberg was saying that even though there are systems that seem like they're egalitarian, they just are on the surface. And he was arguing that really they're all patriarchies, and really that it was rooted in biology in the first place. Right. So, excuse me. You have to note that they had to go outside of anthropology to find somebody who would even argue that, because within anthropology it had been so thoroughly eradicated. Lepowski still, though, was not arguing that there were matriarchies. She was still noting the absence of those, and she was making an argument that there is egalitarianism in the record. And I think that's a fair case. All right. Now, this evolved in a number of different directions. The public-private dichotomy, I don't know how much that's used in the study of sex and gender in anthropology at this point. As I said, most of the time, anthropologists, or at least that I know, and that I've read many, many things from mostly from feminist points of view, and they're basically focused on the identity politics of it and focused on deconstructing masculinity and deconstructing biology. Those are the basic things that they have been focused on for at least since the 1990s. I'm not a huge fan of those positions. Deconstructing people's identities is you can see how that is an existential threat to people. Think about it. If you went up to somebody, identified their personal identity, and said, "Well, I'm going to take that apart for you and show that it's not relevant," they will not react very well, because it is a threat to who they are. In any case, that's what they've been engaged in anthropology pretty much since the 1990s. Started before that, but it became prominent, I think, in the 90s, and pretty much that's mostly what we see now. In any case, we've got some people who are looking for the matriarchy, and Evelyn Blackwood, who not coincidentally was included in the course as well. She wrote the piece on the Minangkabau in Indonesia, and we should have read that by now. And if not, go back and read it, because it's relevant not only to the kinship section, it's relevant to this section as well. And she is known for, she didn't make the case in that particular piece of writing, but she was studying a matrilineal society, right? So they reckoned kinship only through their female relatives, which had a practice of matrilocality, meaning that people who got married and they moved in with or near the wife's family, right? She talked about that's the nature of the society that she was studying. Inheritance went through the female lines because it was matrilineal. Um, Elder women generally controlled all the land in those cases. So she basically described an ethnographic setting in which there were all the elements were there for women to have a lot of power. She also noted that there were some traditional elements of that seemed like patriarchy, but she was pointing out that she basically reformulated the idea of power in a gendered power in an ethnographic context. Um, she said the problem reason we haven't found matriarchies in the ethnographic record is we've been looking for them, the matriarchies that absolutely mirror patriarchies. We're looking for women that act like men do in patriarchies. And she's pointing out, I think rightly, that that's not how it works. Women exercise power in different ways than men, and it looks different, right? So we can't expect the matriarchy to look like a patriarchy. So she was looking at the dynamics of power in a system where basically all the circumstances are right for that power to be there. It's just it may have been overlooked. And I think she made a reasonable case for it, not necessarily in that piece, but elsewhere, that you could consider a society like that to be matriarchal. Right? So she found the matriarchy everybody was looking for, I suppose. But she certainly reformulated the question. And that's the interesting thing. That's what you should try to do, I think, if you're an academic. Try to find the gaps, the gray areas, and things, and reformulate questions and answers in such a way that people understand things better. Right, so I think that was a productive bit of work in examining that. And some of them maybe are not so productive. In any case, we'll leave that where it is. And no, that's Evelyn Blackwood, by the way, and that is her inner field site in Indonesia. Right, and that's also Indonesia. I should have pulled those up before. In any case, that is the end of that section.